Have you ever wondered why a woman's silence can echo louder in a man's mind than any declaration of love or fury? It is because silence is not emptiness, it is space. And space, when it is feminine, carries the weight of the unknown. It is the unlit room in the house of his psyche, the door he keeps opening, expecting to find the same furniture, yet each time it has rearranged itself into something stranger, deeper, more unsettling. Men who have touched only the surface of their own souls do not know what to do with such a silence. They are accustomed to noise, to reactions, to explanations, to the predictable rhythm of emotional commerce. But when a woman withdraws into a silence that is not begging to be broken, he is confronted with something far more dangerous, a mirror in which his own restless mind sees itself. Jung wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And in this, her quiet becomes an unyielding challenge, a chance for him to see the truth or to flee from it. The feminine silence that makes a man restless is not born from weakness. It is not the muted voice of someone who has no words. It is the deliberate choice to let absence speak in her place. In that absence, his projections have no place to land. He cannot tell if she is hurt or indifferent, wounded or liberated, plotting her return or her departure. And the masculine ego, which survives on certainty, feels the sharp edge of her detachment like a blade against glass. You must understand, silence is not passive. In its truest form, it is active restraint. The woman who chooses it is not waiting for him to come closer. She is allowing him to meet himself in the void she leaves. In the quiet, his fantasies rush in to fill the vacuum. His memories of her become sharper, more mythic. Every gesture she ever made, every glance, every half smile now seems infused with a hidden message he failed to read. This is the torment of the male psyche when confronted with the unclaimed territory of the feminine soul. Men who have lived their lives expecting emotional access are especially vulnerable to this. A woman who gives them nothing, no updates, no small signals of where she stands, forces them into shadow work against their will. The restless pacing of his thoughts is not about her actions, but about the way those actions expose the hollowness of his own inner ground. Jung understood this. A man is drawn to a woman not merely for her beauty or her warmth, but for the way she reflects back the parts of himself he has not yet integrated. And when she goes silent, she takes the mirror away. Imagine him in those hours, checking his phone without reason, replaying conversations he once dismissed as unimportant, wondering if the laughter she gave so freely to him is now given to someone else. It is not jealousy in its simple form, but a deeper unease. He begins to realize that her presence once anchored him, not because she belonged to him, but because she gave him a sense of being seen without performance. Now, without that reflection, he is left with the raw discomfort of being alone with his own unlit corridors. And this is where the power lies, not in manipulation, not in cruelty, but in the refusal to soothe the male ego simply to keep it close. Feminine silence at this level is not the absence of connection. It is the protection of selfhood. She understands that speaking too soon, explaining too much, would rob both of them of the truth that only emptiness can reveal. In that vacuum, the masks fall away. He must see whether his desire was for her or for the way she made him feel about himself. To live in this kind of stillness requires a certain inner architecture, a spine of steel beneath the softness, a loyalty to one's own soul above the temporary comfort of reassurance. And this, perhaps more than anything, is what makes her unforgettable. Because while words can be forgotten, silence leaves space for a man's imagination to build temples in her absence. There is a silence that arrives not like a storm, but like winter, gradual, inevitable, stripping away the leaves until nothing remains but the bare truth of the tree. This is the silence that unnerves a man because it cannot be hurried. He may try to coax it open with charm, with apologies, with the familiar rituals of intimacy, but she does not yield. Her stillness is not an invitation. It is a season. And seasons, unlike moods, do not bend to personal will. Men often mistake feminine quiet for retreat, but true quiet is not retreat. It is sovereignty. Jung knew that the anima, the feminine within the male psyche, resists being owned. When a woman withdraws into her own depths, she becomes a living embodiment of that anima, elusive, untouchable, both desired and feared. It is this duality, the longing for her return and the dread of what she might reveal, that keeps his mind restless. In her silence, she is not absent. She is present in a different dimension, the one where words are too shallow to carry the weight of what is felt. She moves there like a priestess in her own temple, tending to the altars of her inner world. And though he cannot see it, he senses it, the sacred work happening beyond his reach. The male ego, which thrives on knowing, begins to fray at the edges when faced with something it cannot map or control. There is another layer to this restlessness: projection. When a woman is silent, she becomes a canvas for a man's unclaimed emotions. Into her stillness, he pours his regrets, his desires, his fears. The same silence that shields her becomes for him a hall of mirrors. Every step he takes toward it, he meets himself. This is why he paces. This is why he replays her last look, her last touch, as if decoding some secret message. Her quiet has transformed into a psychological labyrinth from which he cannot easily escape. And yet, this is not a game she plays for victory. A woman rooted in her own worth does not weaponize her silence. She sanctifies it. She understands what so many do not. The more quickly you speak to soothe a man's anxiety, the more you train him to believe that your role is to steady him at the expense of your own center. Her stillness says, "You will have to find your footing without me." This is both the most generous and the most brutal gift she can give. Sometimes he will try to provoke her into breaking it, pushing her boundaries, stirring the waters, testing her resolve. But the woman who has done her shadow work is not drawn into these small storms. She knows that any reaction given before its time will dissolve the clarity she has built within. So she remains, not frozen, not indifferent, but anchored. Her silence becomes a kind of gravitational pull, not because she chases, but because she refuses to be moved without purpose. This unnerves him more than anger ever could. Anger is predictable. It gives him something tangible to fight. But silence leaves him alone with the vastness of his own interior, and most men have not been taught how to survive in that landscape without a guide. The irony is that he will often misinterpret this as cruelty, when in truth, it is the highest form of respect, allowing another to face themselves without interference. In time, he may begin to understand what her stillness has shown him, or he may run from it, seeking noise elsewhere, convincing himself that a different woman's laughter will quiet the dissonance. Yet even then, her silence remains, haunting the edges of his memory like a place he once stood but could never fully enter. And perhaps this is the most potent form of restlessness. Knowing there is a depth he was invited to meet, and that he turned away before he could touch its floor. There is a silence that arrives not as absence, but as an unbroken gaze turned inward. It is not the quiet of surrender, but the quiet of a queen who has withdrawn from the banquet hall to sit alone in her private chamber where no petitioners are allowed. This is the silence a man feels in his bones before he can name it. It is the subtle closing of a gate he once thought had no lock. It often comes after he has tested her boundaries too many times, thinking they would always bend. Men conditioned by conquest imagine that affection is an inexhaustible resource, that the woman who once gave freely will always give again. But the feminine in her, the true, ancient feminine, knows the exact moment to step back. Not out of anger, but out of recognition. The exchange has become unworthy of her energy. Jung understood that the unconscious withdraws from that which does not feed the soul, and a woman attuned to herself embodies this instinct without apology. Her silence in this phase carries a different weight. It is not the cool mystery of flirtation, nor the pensive quiet of uncertainty. It is the sovereign stillness of someone who has turned the mirror away. For a man, this is disorienting. When her gaze no longer reflects him, he is left staring into himself without guidance. The anima, his inner feminine, has retreated, and with it goes his sense of being seen in a way that feels effortless. He feels an emptiness, but cannot always trace its source. You, as a woman, may not realize how visceral this is for him. Words can be reasoned with, silence must be endured. When you speak, he has cues, directions, a map to follow. But in your stillness, he is adrift. Every unanswered question becomes a thread in his mind, pulled tighter with each passing hour. He may distract himself with noise, with work, with other faces, but the unanswered tension remains. The absence of your voice becomes louder than any argument could. And yet, this is not a silence designed to lure him back. The woman in her power knows that silence is only sacred when it is not used as bait. If it carries even a trace of manipulation, it loses its purity and its depth. True feminine stillness is for herself first, to protect the temple of her energy, to clear the air from the smog of over-explanation. She chooses it because her own peace is worth more than any man's temporary comfort. This distinction is critical. Many confuse this kind of silence with passive aggression. But that is merely the shadow form, the mask of resentment worn by those who have not yet learned to stand in their worth without bitterness. The empowered woman's quiet is different. It does not seek to punish, only to preserve. It is the refusal to dilute herself in the hope of being understood by someone unwilling to listen deeply. For him, the restlessness this evokes is not only about losing access to her presence, it is about losing access to the self he became in her presence. In her eyes, in her words, he once saw a man more vivid, more alive. Now, without that reflection, he is unsure if that man exists at all. This is the unspoken truth of many male attachments. They are not bound to the woman as she is, but to the version of themselves they glimpse in her light. When she withdraws that light, it forces them to reckon with whether they can sustain it alone. And here lies the paradox. Her silence may cause him to chase, but not because she has set a trap. It is because something in him understands, at a level beyond language, that her quiet is not a door left ajar, but a path that closes behind her once she has walked too far. This awareness can keep him circling in thought, replaying the moment he first felt her slipping away, wondering if the silence is temporary or eternal. There is a particular kind of silence that unsettles a man more than any spoken rejection. The silence that follows after she has truly seen him. Not the image he presents, not the polished armor of his persona, but the unguarded self beneath it. Jung taught that the persona is only a mask, a fragile construct meant to shield the ego from the raw truths of the unconscious. When a woman's perception slips past that mask and names the truth without uttering a word, her silence becomes unbearable to him. This is not the silence of withdrawal, but of deep knowing. She carries the weight of what she has seen, and she does not rush to share it. That restraint alone can be maddening, for it denies him the chance to argue, defend, to reframe the story. Without her verbal confirmation, he is left to wrestle with the suspicion that she understands him better than he understands himself. Such silence is powerful because it refuses to be pulled into the performance. In relationships, men often rely on a kind of emotional theater, a back and forth of words, accusations, reconciliations, to reset the narrative on their own terms. But when a woman remains still, she removes the stage entirely. There is nowhere for him to perform, nowhere for his lines to land. And so, the restless energy builds. He will replay moments in his mind, searching for signs that she has spoken her truth in some subtle code. He will listen for what is not said, scan for changes in her expression, overanalyze pauses that once passed unnoticed. Her silence has transformed into a living question mark, one he cannot ignore. In that space, his own shadow rises. The parts of himself he would rather keep hidden, now illuminated by the absence of her reassurance. For the woman, this kind of stillness is a form of discipline. It takes strength to witness without reacting, to know without the need to announce. This is the territory of the integrated feminine, where compassion does not require rescue, and perception does not demand proof. She understands that the moment she breaks the silence to comfort him, she takes back the work his soul has been asked to do, and she will not rob him of that confrontation, even if it means being misunderstood. To the uninitiated man, this feels like distance. To the man who has met his own depths, it feels like initiation. In either case, the quiet pushes him toward the threshold of self-awareness. Whether he crosses it is not her concern. Her role was never to walk it for him. The most dangerous thing about this silence is its honesty. There is no manipulation, no agenda, no performance. It simply holds a mirror to reality and refuses to blur the reflection. A man can distract himself from words. Words can be argued with, rationalized, diminished. But he cannot easily distract himself from the sensation of being seen and left with that truth in the dark. Sometimes this restlessness turns into obsession. not because he is in love in the romantic sense, but because he is in love with the idea of getting back to the place where her eyes held him without judgment. Her silence now feels like a locked garden, and he longs for the ease with which he once wandered there. But the woman who knows her worth does not reopen the gate simply because he lingers outside. She understands that entry without transformation is only a return to the old patterns, and she will not be the caretaker of his illusions. This is where her silence becomes an act of mercy, not the soft, comforting mercy of easing his pain, but the fierce mercy of refusing to collude with his avoidance of truth. If he feels restless in that space, it is because the stillness has revealed a hunger that cannot be filled by possession, flattery, or control. It is the hunger to know himself, stripped of the projections that her presence once carried. And if he is wise, he will learn that her silence was not a punishment, but an invitation to step into his own depth. There is a silence that comes at the end of a cycle, not sudden, not sharp, but slow, like the last embers of a fire fading into ash. It is the silence of completion, the one that says without words, the story has been told. For a man, this is the most disquieting of all, because it leaves no loose threads to tug, no doors ajar, no promise of a return. It is the silence of a woman who has turned inward, not for pause, but for closure. Jung often wrote of individuation, the process by which a person becomes whole, integrating the shadow and bringing the unconscious into light. When a woman reaches this state within a relationship or dynamic, her silence is not emptiness, but fulfillment. She is no longer speaking to be heard, no longer explaining herself in the hope of being understood. She has gathered all the fragments of her own energy back into her hands, and she will not scatter them again. To him, this quiet feels like a wall. He senses that something irrevocable has shifted. Even if she stands before him, her energy no longer leans toward him. It is entirely her own. This is the silence that makes a man restless in a way he cannot soothe with apologies or promises. It is not the storm that can be weathered or the distance that can be crossed. It is the end of the road, and his restlessness comes from realizing that there is nowhere left to go. You, as a woman, may recognize this moment by the absence of inner conflict. There is no urge to prove a point, no simmering resentment, no lingering hope that he will finally understand. There is simply space, clean, uninhabited space where once there was entanglement. And it is in this space that you feel the lightness of your own spirit, the quiet hum of your own life force returning to its rightful center. For him, however, this emptiness feels like a haunting. He may find himself thinking of you in moments that have no reason to summon you. A scent in the air, the way a certain light falls across a room, the sound of distant laughter. These will stir something deep and uneasy in him. Not because he misses what you gave him, but because he knows, even without admitting it, that he stood before something sacred and treated it as ordinary. This restlessness is the shadow's whisper. You touched the rare and let it slip away. Men often try to bury this awareness under new pursuits, new faces, new conquests, but the mind has a way of keeping such truths alive in its hidden chambers. The silence of completion plants itself there like an unmovable stone, a reminder that some doors close not with a slam, but with a ceiling so quiet it feels almost unreal. What he will eventually come to understand, if he allows himself to, is that your stillness was never about punishing him. It was about ending the cycle that kept you both small. In withdrawing your voice, you also withdrew the patterns that fed his complacency and drained your spirit. The restlessness he feels is the ache of an ego stripped of its comfort, of a man left to walk the corridors of his own psyche without the guiding light you once provided. And here is the truth that cannot be softened. The silence that ends a cycle is also the silence that births a new life. But that life will not always include him. You have crossed a threshold he may never reach, one that is not about him at all, but about the unshakable knowing that your worth is not something to be debated, bargained for, or proved. In this final form, silence becomes liberation. It is the clearing of the field after the harvest, the ocean returning to its calm after the tide. It is not the beginning of a waiting game. It is the end of a chapter in which your energy was defined by someone else's gravity. And from here, the horizon is yours alone. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.